Hello, a very quick note before we get started. During the recording of this session and even leading up to it, we were having lots of technical problems. And as it happens, near the end of the session, I got kicked out of the platform and I just couldn't log back in despite trying my best. So it's rather annoying, but we're releasing this episode anyway because we were able to capture about 90% of what we were hoping for. And what we have got is very useful, and I hope you enjoy it. I am grateful for Mouin for his patience, his flexibility, and also his time that he gave us. And I'm hoping that if we can have him back, we can continue the conversation where we left off. Mouin is amazing, and I really enjoyed talking to him. So let's get started. Thank you. Hello, and welcome everyone to this episode of the Afghanistan podcast. Joining us today, we have a Dutch-Palestinian political analyst, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin is one of the best geopolitical commentators that I've heard of. So I'm really excited to have him with us today to get his thoughts on the current situation. Mouin, thank you for joining us.
It's a real pleasure to be with you, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Mouin, to get straight to the point, talking about this current conflict that took place between Iran and Israel, one of my observations was that like countries these days, states, they spend huge resources on intelligence gathering, on monitoring, observing every single move, every movement, every word that comes out of the enemy, even friends. But still in battle, sometimes they're still able to surprise each other. And we kind of saw that on day one when Israel took Iran by surprise. And we also saw it later on when Israel itself was surprised by how quickly Iran was able to regroup, but also how effective their missiles were. So what's your thoughts on that? And also, how do you see tactically and strategically the outcome of this conflict?
Yeah, I think those observations are spot on. Clearly, on the first day, we all learned, along with the Iranians, that Israel had very successfully managed to penetrate Iran and its leadership and so on very deeply, and was able to carry out this whole series of, let's call them high-value assassinations of senior military and intelligence commanders, of prominent scientists, and so on. And additionally, was able to conduct a kind of immediate shock and awe campaign with its widespread bombings throughout Iran, many of which appear to have been conducted by drone strikes that originated within Iranian territory. So that was clearly an enormous success for Israel. But I think Israel's problem is often that it mistakes tactical success for strategic victory. And I think this was another such case. Israel essentially sought to replicate the decapitation strike it successfully carried out against Hezbollah in Lebanon last year. There's an important difference, of course, between Hezbollah and Iran. Iran is a proper state. Iran controls the entirety of its territory. Iran has a monopoly on violence within Iran. Iran does not face the kind of ambiguous, difficult relationship with the state that Hezbollah had in Lebanon, and so on. And more importantly, we also learned that Iran is not only an autocratic regime, but also a state with institutions, and fairly diffuse institutions. And it was able to not only absorb this shocking blow, but to quickly replace those who had been assassinated, to regroup and to begin retaliating against Israel, against the unprovoked war of aggression launched against it by Israel. And so this, I think, as you mentioned, Iran taken by surprise, and then Israel taken by surprise. As far as Israel's war objectives are concerned, yes, of course, it wanted to eradicate Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, and so on. But it was quite clear from the outset that for Israel, the only decisive outcome would be one in which the Iranian leadership and regime either collapsed or were overthrown. Because as anyone who has looked at this issue has told you, that would have told you, absent regime change in Tehran, there is nothing that the Israeli, or for that matter, U.S. Air Force could inflict on Iran that could not be rebuilt, perhaps with even greater determination than before. And on that score, I think Israel's war clearly failed. It has not eliminated Iran's nuclear program, because irrespective of the serious damage that was undoubtedly inflicted on a number of installations by Israel, and more importantly, by the United States, the level and extent of personnel and knowledge and so on, and again, remaining equipment with Iran is just too large and too diffuse to be eliminated by a bombing run. By a bombing campaign. Regarding Iran's ballistic missile campaign, well, you only need to have a television screen to judge for yourself how effective the efforts to eliminate that program have been. And so, quite clearly, in my view, and there are multiple Israeli statements confirming this, the purpose of the war, the strategic objective of the war, from Israel's perspective, was regime change. And on that score, it demonstrably failed. For Iran, I think its key strategic objectives were to prevent a situation in which it would be compelled to capitulate, to keep the United States out of the war, something on which it clearly failed, and to demonstrate the will to keep responding to Israeli attacks. So I think it's very much a mixed bag. And when you have what is essentially a draw, I think then you have to look at the wisdom of the party that initiated this war with clear objectives and failed to achieve them.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode.
So true. I do think, absolutely, I agree that I think Israel tried to take that decapitation model of Hezbollah and try to apply that on Iran. But I think also from at least the rhetoric that was coming out, I think what happened in Syria really impacted Israel as well, because they saw that after such long sanctions, the opposition was just able to walk in and the government just kind of liquidated. And I don't know, there was news at that time coming out that Israel was saying this is what we could do to Iran and Iran is weak. But rhetoric is one side. Hard, like code analysis with all of Israel's intelligence. I'm still so shocked that they thought that they could actually do a regime change just by airstrikes. We'll come back to the conflict between Israel and Iran, but what do you think? How is Syria taking all of this? Because Syrian current government is like a sworn enemy of Iran. So how do you think, seeing the outcome of this, it would have taken them aback a little bit?
Well, you mentioned Syria and the ouster of the Assad regime last December, and you may recall that at the time, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sought to present this as the result of Israel's warfare in the region during the past 2 years. Undoubtedly, Israel contributed to creating the situation in which the Assad regime could be ousted from power so easily. But I don't think it was the primary reason. The primary reason, of course, was a very brittle nature of the Syrian regime, the prolonged and deepening economic crisis, the complete inability and unwillingness of the Syrian leadership, and particularly Assad personally, to entertain any form of meaningful dialogue with any element of the opposition. He was out for total victory, despite advice he had gotten to change his attitude, particularly from the Russians. And you had a situation that when the opposition launched its offensive, which I think initially was intended as a fairly limited offensive to seek to seize Aleppo, or at least parts of it, none of the regime's forces were prepared to fight, and they just collapsed. And in my view, the key roles played in the fall of the Assad regime were Turkey more than Israel. And then, of course, the crucial decisions by Russia and Iran, which had become increasingly frustrated with leadership in Damascus, that they refused to throw good money after bad and make a concerted effort to save his skin. So yes, Israel contributed, but presenting this as kind of an Israeli initiative, an Israeli achievement, I think falls quite far off the mark. Iran is a different kettle of fish. Well, first of all, because like you said, regime change from the air doesn't really have much of a precedent. But although Iran is undoubtedly an authoritarian state, it is not a highly personalized regime, the way, for example, Syria under Assad or Libya under Gaddafi was. And it's a system that can survive the removal of its supreme leader. So in that sense, I think there was a lot of wishful thinking. And the other factor, of course, is, yes, Iran is experiencing a prolonged, very serious, and in fact deepening economic crisis, primarily on account of the sanctions placed on that country, and also, mismanagement and corruption by its elites. And yes, there is widespread disaffection with the Iranian leadership among the general population of Iran. But, there is overwhelming historical evidence that the impact of foreign aggression on any society generally unites people against the foreign aggressor rather than polarizes a society further against its leadership, regardless of how distasteful they may find that leadership to be. And I would argue that Israel, more than any other government, should have been aware of this, because as you may recall, for an entire year prior to the Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th, 2023, there had been large and growing and increasingly intense mass demonstrations by Israelis against the Netanyahu government on account of its legislative agenda to completely subordinate the Israeli judiciary to the will and whim of the Israeli government. Yet the moment these attacks happened, all the reserve pilots who said they would refuse to serve, and all the soldiers and others who had been participating in these demonstrations immediately reported to their duty stations and began implementing this now almost 2-year-long live-streamed genocide. In other words, the Hamas attacks helped to unite Israeli society rather than polarize and divide it further. But Israel, for some reason, adopted the wishful thinking that these attacks, particularly given their widespread nature and the large number of civilians that were killed, entire families incinerated in their apartments in order to assassinate a single scientist and so on. Israel seems to have believed that doing so would cause not only the government to collapse, but also the society to become more polarized and rise up against the clerical regime. And that somehow, within a matter of weeks, not only would the regime be overthrown, but its favorite Iranian, the son of the ousted Shah, would be coronated in Tehran. I mean, it was absolutely crazy wishful thinking. Again, mistaking tactical success for strategic victory.
Absolutely. Yes. So apparently this crown prince, the son of the Shah of Iran, the former Shah of Iran, he even went to...
Well, he's not a crown prince. He's the son of the former Shah, but he has absolutely no official title or function within Iran.
Yeah. He even apparently went to Palestine, Israel, and he went to the Wailing Wall, maybe to honor the Israelis, but at the same time, he didn't even bother to go to Al-Quds or... so it was very strange kind of messaging that he was giving and kind of informing Israel of his loyalty to Israel and to USA. So it's very bizarre, but I think that also kind of damaged his reputation further inside Iran, if he has any in there.
Well, yes. I mean, it's unclear how much credibility he had left to lose, even prior to the war. I mean, he's extraordinarily popular among some elements of the exiled Iranian opposition, but is also involved in a virtual civil war with the Mujahideen Khalq faction, which was actually involved in ousting his father from power in the late 1970s, and is now being fronted by people such as New York, Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York. But, just to get back to the point, it's unclear if he had any credibility. The available evidence suggests it was between 0.0 and 0.1%. And I don't know when he visited Israel, but these statements he made during the war, effectively embracing an unprovoked war of aggression against what he claims is his own country and openly cheerleading for it, I think has, I can't imagine that he will ever be visiting the country of his birth again.
Yeah, looks like it. Moin, how do you see the role of Trump in this whole episode? Because he's in classical Trump style. It's hard to pin him down to anything. He's gone from saying we have nothing to do with this to trying to claim all credit for what's happening. And then from going to regime change to no regime change, and then talking about how the Iranian nuclear program has been obliterated, when intelligence says completely the opposite of that. But what do you think his motivation is in all of this? There's different ways of seeing it. We can either say that he's responsible for all this war, and he's maybe the key instigator, and they've been planning this from March, apparently. So all of these talks were just a ruse, and they were never serious about this at all. But on the other hand, maybe it can also be seen that there was no way that USA could have sat this out when Israel was getting hammered. If Israel was on top, I think maybe USA could have sat it out. But given how much damage was being inflicted on Israel and how Israel was panicking and begging USA to get involved, and given the influence of the lobby and the deep state, it would have happened. They would have had to enter. But maybe the way he entered, it seems like he informed the Iranian government this is what he's about to do. And then likewise, they informed USA when they attacked the bases in Qatar. So maybe it could even be seen as him giving an out to all three parties, to Iran, to Israel, to USA. How do you see it, or his role?
Well, it's a complex question, so I'm going to have to ask your indulgence for a fairly lengthy answer, which is in significant part speculative because it will take months or years, to get the relevant records and details unless the defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, has another night out on the town and starts a new signal group soon. But that notwithstanding, I think the first thing you have to decide is whether you believe one of two things. Either the Trump administration entered office in January determined to unleash a military confrontation with Iran, or it was initially serious about avoiding war and pursuing a diplomatic resolution. And people who believe that the talks were never serious to begin with point to the first Trump administration, when, of course, the United States unilaterally repudiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, better known as Iran Nuclear Agreement, replaced it with a policy of maximum pressure, conducted the assassination of the Quds Force commander, General Soleimani, and more importantly, during the first Trump administration, there was a close alignment between the United States, Israel, and conservative Arab states about the need to renounce the nuclear agreement, about maximum pressure, about further weakening and isolating Iran, and ultimately about achieving regime change in Tehran. You may remember these videos produced by acolytes of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman that showed Saudi troops marching through the center of Tehran and so on. That was a situation during the first Trump administration, but several things happened in the interim. Most importantly, the Arab states effectively backed out of this coalition on account of the sophisticated and successful Iranian drone and missile attack on the key Aramco facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia in 2019, and the growing volume of Houthi Ansarullah missile attacks on Saudi and later Emirati territory during the Yemen war. These states began to realize not only how vulnerable they would be to Iranian reprisals in any armed confrontation, but also that their partners in Israel and the United States were either unable or unwilling to defend and protect them, and that they would therefore be in the front line and the main victims of any such conflict. Yes, they would very much have liked to see the back of the Iranian regime, but came to the conclusion that the costs of achieving this outcome would be prohibitively expensive. Then within the United States, we saw growing sections of the anti-interventionist camp drift from the Democratic Party, whose leadership effectively became the war party, and become an essential component of the MAGA cult in the Republican Party, Trump's personal base. And so that had to be taken into account in Washington's decision-making as well. And, you know, when Trump came into office, the fact that he announced these in April, announced these negotiations with Iran, with a very dejected Netanyahu summoned to sit by his side. I think, you know, in this broader context, one in which the Arab states had been encouraging, in fact, Trump to pursue diplomacy with Iran because they had themselves normalized relations with Tehran in the interim. You may recall the Chinese-mediated Saudi-Iranian normalization agreement, the Emirates normalizing or restoring diplomatic relations with Iran, a whole series of consultations between Iran and the GCC states on the other shore of the Persian Gulf, and so on. In this broader context, I believe that Trump was serious, at least about exploring the possibility of diplomatic resolution. And I think also very much wanted to achieve one, both to avoid war and so he could claim, you know, being the narcissist that he is, that he had achieved, he had succeeded where his predecessor, Joe Biden, had failed. And the first few rounds of negotiations did appear to be serious. during this period, of course, the U.S. red line, which Iran was prepared to live with, was that Washington required absolute watertight guarantees that Iran would not and could not ever acquire a nuclear weapon. The Iranian red line was that it would never renounce the rights that it enjoys under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which it is a signatory, unlike Israel, of course. Its right to enrich uranium on its own soil at very low levels for exclusively civilian purposes under international supervision by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And the two parties appeared to be trying to find an agreement that lay between these two red lines. There was a serious issue, and that concerns the 400 or so kilograms of highly enriched uranium that Iran possesses, and what to do with it. The Americans wanted it removed from Iran, as its stockpile of enriched uranium had been removed to Russia, pursuant to the 2015 JCPOA. The Iranian position was that they wanted to keep it on Iranian soil under strict IAEA supervision, because they wanted this stockpile to serve as an insurance policy in case the Americans once again signed an agreement, got what they wanted, and then renounced the agreement. But nevertheless, negotiations seem to be ongoing. Then suddenly, I think after the third or fourth round of negotiations, Trump and Witkoff began trumpeting this demand that Iran renounce its rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and no longer enrich any uranium on its own soil. They proposed this regional consortium, which Iran was in principle prepared to work with, but not if one of its key conditions is that enrichment would only take place outside Iran. And in my view, what happened is quite clear. You have a coalition of Israel loyalists within the Trump administration, Congress, the U.S. media, and so on, and war hawks more generally within the U.S., who sought to successfully to persuade Trump and his envoy, Witkoff, that not only was this a realistic demand, but one that the Iranians could be compelled to accept. You may recall at the outset, these same people kept talking loudly and publicly about the Libyan model. The Libyan model is one in which state renounces its weapons of mass destruction and its nuclear program, and once it has done so, NATO launches a war against that country and sodomizes the leader to death. And Trump at the time had been immediately shut these people up because he saw them as sabotaging the negotiations. Nevertheless, what happened here is that Trump and Witkoff were persuaded that this was a viable negotiating strategy, assisted probably, by the removal of so much expertise and specialized knowledge from within the U.S. government, thanks to Elon Musk's efforts to gut the U.S. bureaucracy. Iran predictably rejected that demand out of hand. And I think at that point, Trump and Witkoff were persuaded that if they endorsed and supported an Israeli attack on Iran, and perhaps they also believed that they were not in a position to stop it, so might as well support it, that this would strengthen the U.S. negotiating position because Iran would be down on its knees. The U.S. could essentially dictate to Iran the outcome of subsequent negotiations. In other words, this whole series of measures were proposed to the U.S. leadership not as a regime change effort, which for its sponsors it so clearly was, but rather as measures that would enhance and improve the U.S. negotiating position, which secured a U.S. buy-in. And then, of course, once the war started, and the missiles started flying at Tel Aviv, and Israel was unable to destroy key nuclear installations, you go back to the U.S. and say, look, all you need is a few B-52s, a few 30,000-pound bombs, one and done, and game over. So my view is that Trump and Witkoff, and let's not forget, Trump is not exactly the brightest bulb in the box. He may believe he's a stable genius, but he's very much on the opposite end of the stability and genius spectrum. That they were essentially snookered into endorsing a policy on the pretext that it would serve their agenda rather than undermine it. That's how I think we got today. I know there are people who believe war was the plan for Trump and his closest advisors all along. I think there were divisions within the administration. I don't think Trump personally was dead set on this course, but along the way became increasingly persuaded, but for reasons other than the objectives that the war party had set for itself.
I tend to agree with your analysis, but then now the question is, so if they did this with the motivation that this is going to soften up Iran, put them under pressure to then come back to the negotiation table on USS's terms, and given that the outcome of this has been very opposite to what USA and Israel thought is going to happen, doesn't that now make it more difficult? It hardens Iran's position a bit more, theoretically, because they're thinking, you've done the worst and nothing happened to us, we're still standing. So what else can you do now? But at the same time, I've heard, I think it came out in CNN, Trump is thinking of starting talks again next week through negotiators, US negotiators and Iranian negotiators. And there's lots of things on the table. I think there's talks of $20 to $30 billion investment into Iran, unfreezing $6 billion
money.
assets. Yes, lifting sanctions. Also, I think it's the same kind of a group outside of Middle Eastern countries that will get together a consortium of enrichment that Iran can be part of. But all of that is still saying it's the same red lines from both countries that is going to get unstuck on, because USA still doesn't want enrichment happening in Iran, and Iran is insistent on it. So where do we go from here?
Yes. Yeah, look, just to get back to how this ended. Yes, last week the U.S. changed its posture from one of supplying the weapons Israel required to attack Iran, from providing it intelligence support, from participating in missile defense of Israeli territory, to directly conducting offensive operations in Iranian territory. That's all true. But if you look at these U.S. attacks, they were 3 bombing raids against 3 specific nuclear installations, rather than the opening salvo of a much more widespread U.S. campaign against Iran that targeted, for example, its military infrastructure or its regime. So I think that also supports the point that the U.S. was seeking to improve its negotiating position rather than achieve a broader agenda in Iran. And then, the Iranians had repeatedly threatened that any U.S. attack would be met with a ferocious Iranian retaliatory response. Now, many people will say, yes, they're certainly capable of doing this, so why didn't they? Well, first of all, doing so would have guaranteed precisely the widespread U.S. military campaign against Iran that the Iranian leadership was hoping to avoid. And second of all, Iran could only have retaliated by striking U.S. assets on the territory of the Gulf states with which it had been assiduously cultivating improved relations for a number of years. So it would have burned all those bridges. And if it would have, for example, blocked the Strait of Hormuz and together in partnership with Ansar Allah also blocked Bab al-Mandab at the entrance to the Red Sea, that would have strained relations with the Gulf states even further. It would have ensured that Iran could no longer export oil. And yes, while it would have increased prices at the pump for the MAGA base during their summer holidays in the United States, it would have also, the main importer of Gulf energy is, of course, China, with which Iran has been building an increasingly close relationship. So we also learned that throughout this entire war, channels of communication did remain open between the United States and Iran. And quite clearly, you then had a thoroughly choreographed response where the Iranians fired a number of ballistic missiles at a key U.S. Air Force base in Qatar that had already been evacuated. These missiles were either intercepted or caused damage, but in any case caused no casualties, allowing Trump to dismiss them as harmless firecrackers, which they essentially were, and not have to make good on his own threats to retaliate with fire and brimstone against the Iranians. And then he immediately announced a ceasefire and imposed it on the Israelis. Many people are pointing out, correctly in my view, that Israel, which has a military doctrine that all its wars must be short, decisive, and waged on enemy territory, had to absorb more serious blows on its home front than in any war since it was established in the mid-20th century. And additionally, the joint U.S.-Israeli anti-missile defenses were getting visibly degraded and additionally depleted. So there was that motivation for the U.S. to impose a ceasefire. But Iran, for its part, while it was still standing, obviously was also getting seriously hurt and damaged. And in the context of a prolonged war of attrition, Iran may well have been in a better position to conduct such a war and absorb its repercussions. But that would also have very seriously damaged Iran, and with the passage of time, increased the likelihood that the U.S. would get involved in the way precisely that Iran was hoping to avoid. So now, we have a ceasefire. It's clearly only going to be sustainable if it leads to a meaningful political process or diplomatic resolution. And the first issue will be Iran's insistence that this cannot be a repeat of the ceasefire achieved in Lebanon in late last year, where Hezbollah is required to strictly adhere to every letter and punctuation mark in the agreement, but Israel remains free to attack Lebanon at will. In other words, the Iranian position is that they will not negotiate under fire, because if they do, overwhelming military force will be hanging over their head like a sword of Damocles. And every time there's a logjam in the negotiations, you can expect new bombing campaigns against Iran. I suspect that is going to be their essential requirement. Secondly, if and when these negotiations resume, the key Iranian demand is going to be its rights under the NPT and the U.S. position that Iran should renounce those rights. I think particularly after the war, and Iran is going to insist on them to an even greater extent than before. And the Americans will have to decide whether their priority is a diplomatic resolution that prevents Iran from getting the bomb, or these demands that will ensure renewed conflict sooner or later. And then the other issue, of course, is sanctions relief. And then more importantly, how will Iran now deal with the deliberate, willful destruction of the nuclear regulatory regime by Israel and the United States, who violated the core principle of that regime by both being nuclear states, attacking nuclear installations in a non-nuclear state that were under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Iran is not allowing these inspectors to come back formally because it suspects them of having collaborated with Israel by providing it with information and so on, but I think mainly to prove a point and make the U.S. pay a price for that. But will Iran now, on the basis of what has happened, for example, renounce the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and make a rush towards acquiring a nuclear bomb? In response to the first Trump administration's renunciation of the Iran nuclear agreement, Iran began enriching uranium to ever higher levels and is now considered a nuclear threshold state. And what that means is that for Iran, the development of a nuclear bomb is one political decision away rather than a lengthy technological and scientific process away. Everyone who has looked at this issue, with the exception, of course, of Tulsi Gabbard, who changed her mind about this issue last week, everyone who has looked at this issue has determined that there is no evidence that Iran has taken that political decision. But I suspect in the wake of what's happened, you will now have people within the Iranian leadership, within the power structure, and within Iranian public opinion, demanding that Iran junk this nuclear regulatory regime, which has proven absolutely useless and which has been violated at will by the nuclear power that is the United States and by the undeclared nuclear power, coddled and indulged, whose nuclear arsenal is coddled and indulged by the West, and should go its own way. And what's being argued is you basically have two options, North Korea or Iraq, and that Iran's strategic mistake was not maintaining this nuclear program, but rather deploying its nuclear program as a bargaining chip rather than as a pathway to acquiring the ultimate deterrent as rapidly as possible.